The night my best friend signed me up for a blind date, without telling me, I was elbow deep in sourdough dough and genuinely at peace with my life. That's the thing nobody mentions about owning a bakery in Vancouver. You stop thinking about your love life entirely. You think about proofing times and humidity levels and whether the butter croissants are going to be worth the 4 a.m. start. You think about your hydro bill and your lease renewal and that one Yelp review from a man named Gary, who called your banana bread aggressively moist. You think about Gary a lot, actually, more than you think about men. So when my best friend texted me at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, "Just FYI, I gave your number to someone. His name is Tristan. He'll text you Thursday." I read it 3 times, put my phone face down on the flour-dusted counter, and went back to the dough. I didn't text her back. I know. That's not normal. But here's the thing about running a small business in your early 30s in one of the most expensive cities in the country. You get very good at ignoring the things you can't deal with right now. The bakery was called The Morning Ledge. I'd opened it 4 years ago in a narrow little space on Commercial Drive, back when I still thought rent was the scary part. I did everything myself at the start, baked, served, cleaned, did the books at midnight with a glass of wine and a spreadsheet I barely understood. My aunt had loaned me the startup money, $22,000. I'd paid her back in full 2 Christmases ago, and she'd cried, and I'd cried, and then we'd eaten too much butter tart and watched a terrible movie, and it was the best night of my life. The bakery wasn't making me rich, but it was mine, and I liked that better. Thursday came. Tristan texted, "Hey, Shelby gave me your number. Hope that's okay. I was thinking Saturday if you're free. There's a place in Yaletown I've been meaning to try." I stared at the message for longer than I'd like to admit. Yaletown. So he had opinions about restaurants. That was either a good sign or a sign he was the kind of person who said foodie without irony. I genuinely couldn't tell. I texted back, "Saturday works. Send me the details." Then I went back to my croissants. The restaurant was called Perch. It was the kind of place with amber lighting and a wine list that came on a wooden board and servers who told you their name like they were confiding something. I'd walked past it before and assumed it wasn't for people like me. Not in a self-pitying way, just in a practical, budget-aware way. My usual Saturday dinner involved a bowl of pasta and whatever Netflix had added that week. I wore the green dress. My aunt had given it to me for my birthday, and I'd worn it exactly once, to a work event where I'd felt overdressed and uncomfortable all night. But it fit well, and it was the nicest thing I owned, so I arrived 7 minutes early, because I am incapable of being anything else, and I told the host I was meeting someone, and she led me to a table near the window, overlooking the street. It was a beautiful table. Soft light, white tablecloth, the kind of candle that actually smells good instead of like a car air freshener. I sat down. I looked at the menu. I ordered a sparkling water, and then I heard his voice. Not Tristan's voice, my ex's voice. I didn't look up right away. My brain did that thing it does sometimes where it decides, no, that's not possible. You are misidentifying a stranger, and tries to protect you from reality for just a second longer. But then I heard his laugh, that specific laugh, the one that always sounded like he was amused at something the rest of the room hadn't caught up to yet. And I looked up. He was standing at the host station. 4 years. 4 years since I'd last seen him. And he looked exactly the same, which was deeply unfair. Same easy confidence. Same way of tilting his head when he talked to someone like they were the only person in the room. He was with a woman. Pretty, in a sleek way, and the host was leading them directly toward me. I looked back down at my menu. Be normal, I told myself. You run a business. You wake up at 4 a.m. You survived your first Christmas rush alone when the oven broke on December 22nd. You can survive this. They sat 2 tables away. He hadn't seen me yet. I took a sip of my sparkling water and tried to remember if Tristan had given me any identifying details, because I suddenly needed him to arrive immediately. That was when the chair across from me moved. I looked up, expecting Tristan. It was not Tristan. The man who had pulled out the chair and was now, without any particular urgency, without asking, with the specific calmness of someone who has never needed to explain themselves. Sitting down across from me was not anyone I had ever seen before. He was tall even sitting down. Dark suit, no tie, The collar of his shirt open just enough. The kind of face that takes a moment to process. Not conventionally handsome in a magazine way, but the kind of handsome that has weight to it, like something that's been carved slowly. There was a scar along his jaw that he hadn't bothered to hide and eyes that were doing something I couldn't immediately identify. They were looking at me like he recognized me, which was impossible because I had never seen this man in my life. "I'm sorry," I said, very politely. "I'm waiting for someone." "I know," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, like a man who had never been in a rush. "He's not coming." I stared at him. "Tristan had a conflict," the man said, and something about how he said conflict suggested that the conflict had been arranged rather than discovered. "He sends his apologies. I stopped. "Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. He picked up the wine menu from the table, looked at it briefly, set it back down. Then he looked at me again with those steady, impossible-to-read eyes. "Someone who was walking past," he said, "and noticed that you looked like you needed someone to sit down." I glanced. Involuntarily, embarrassingly, in the direction of my ex's table. When I looked back, the man across from me had followed my gaze. He looked back at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more interesting than that. "Ah," he said quietly. "Don't," I said. "I didn't say anything. You were about to." "I was going to ask," he said, "if you'd like to order the tasting menu or if you'd prefer to choose. I find tasting menus are either very good or aggressively ambitious, depending on the chef." I looked at him for a long moment. "You don't know me," I said. "No," he agreed. "You're sitting at my table." "I am. You apparently canceled my blind date." He had the audacity to look mildly offended. "I didn't cancel anything. I said Tristan had a conflict." "Did he?" A pause. "He will by the time he checks his phone." I should have asked him to leave. I know that. I know that's what a rational person does. When a stranger sits down at their table in a Yaletown restaurant and speaks in comfortable half-truths and looks at them like they're the only thing in the room worth looking at. But from 2 tables away, I could hear my ex's voice rising slightly as he made a point to his date. And something in my chest did that tight, familiar clench that I thought I'd finished with years ago. And I looked across the table at this complete stranger and said, in a voice much calmer than I felt, "I want the tasting menu." The corner of his mouth moved. "Good choice," he said. His name was Rafferty. He told me without me asking, about 20 minutes in, when we were halfway through the second course, and I had learned that he was originally from Halifax, that he had 2 older brothers he described as dramatic in different and very specific ways, and that he had opinions about sourdough that were unusually well-informed for someone who was clearly not a baker. "How do you know about hydration ratios?" I asked. "I had a phase," he said. "What kind of phase?" "The kind where you're stuck in an apartment for a few months and you run out of things to be competent at." There was something under that sentence. I didn't push. "I own a bakery," I said. "On Commercial Drive. The Morning Ledge," he said. I set down my fork. "How do you know that?" He looked at me evenly. "You have flour on your left wrist." I looked down. There it was, a faint dusting of flour, just above my watch, because I'd been crimping pastry shells until 6 and clearly hadn't scrubbed well enough. "I guessed from context," he added. "It's a reasonable inference." "That's either very observant or slightly alarming," I said. "Both are possible," he said without any apparent concern. "I should explain that I am not a person who is easily charmed. I have run a business alone for 4 years. I have dealt with suppliers who didn't show, landlords who invented problems, accountants who used the phrase, 'You should have done this differently,' in a tone that meant you have made a series of catastrophic errors. I have dealt with my aunt's well-meaning concern about my personal life, delivered over the phone while I was simultaneously fixing a stand mixer and reviewing my Q3 numbers. I am not a woman who melts." But there was something about Rafferty that I found genuinely, unexpectedly difficult to categorize. He didn't perform. That was the thing. Most people, on a first date or any approximation of a first date, perform. They tell you their highlights. They angle the conversation toward the best version of themselves. Rafferty just talked, directly, occasionally dryly, with long pauses where he seemed to actually be thinking, rather than just waiting to speak. and he listened in a way that made you feel like you were saying something worth hearing. "Tell me about the bakery," he said. So I told him. Not the brochure version. Not I always loved baking and followed my passion, but the real version. The terrifying lease signing, the 2 weeks in year 1, where I genuinely thought I was going to have to call my aunt and tell her I'd lost everything. The morning I dropped an entire tray of pain au chocolat on the floor at 5 a.m. and sat down next to the mess and cried for 10 minutes before cleaning it up and starting over. "Why'd you keep going?" he asked. "Because it was mine," I said. "And I'm stubborn." He nodded, slowly. Like that was the right answer. "What do you do?" I asked. A small pause. "Real estate," he said. "Acquisitions, primarily." Something about how he said it was slightly too neat, like a sentence that had been edited. But the wine was very good, and the halibut had arrived, and I decided I didn't need all the information at once. Across the room, I'd almost forgotten about my ex. Then I heard his voice again, louder now, and I caught the word brilliant in the tone he always used when he was explaining himself, and something in my expression must have shifted, because Rafferty noticed. "How long were you together?" he asked. 3 years, I said. "We broke up 4 years ago." "What happened?" I looked at him. People don't usually ask that directly. "He thought I was making a mistake," I said. "Leaving my job to open the bakery. He thought I was being romantic about something that wasn't going to work. And you disagreed." "I did. And it worked," I said, simply, because it was true. Rafferty was quiet for a moment. "Does it bother you," he asked, "that he can still walk into the same restaurant?" I thought about it honestly. "It bothered me 40 minutes ago," I said. "A little less now." That small, not quite smile again. I was starting to understand. It was as close as he usually got to open amusement. We stayed through all 7 courses. We stayed through the palate cleanser, which was a tiny cube of cucumber sorbet that arrived in what appeared to be a shot glass, and which Rafferty regarded with polite skepticism before eating it without comment. We stayed through the petit fours. We stayed until the restaurant was mostly empty, and the servers were doing that subtle, professional thing where they begin gently resetting nearby tables as a suggestion. When the bill came, he took it before I'd even reached for my bag. I started to object on principle. We were strangers. It was technically my date that he'd apparently derailed for reasons still not fully explained, and he just looked at me in that unhurried way and said, "Next time you can argue about it." Next time. I didn't comment on that either. Outside on the street, the air was cool and damp in that particular Vancouver way. The kind of night that smells like rain that happened earlier in Cedar and the city. We stood on the sidewalk and I thought about what I was supposed to say. "Thank you for sitting down uninvited and being oddly good company. My car is that way," he said. "My car is that way," I said, pointing in the opposite direction. He nodded. Then he took out a card and held it out. Just a name and a number printed clean on white cardstock. No company name, no title. "Call me," he said, "or don't. But I think you will." "You think very highly of yourself," I said. "I think very highly of the conversation," he said. "There's a difference." I took the card. I walked to my car. I sat in it for a full minute before driving anywhere. I called him 9 days later. It wasn't. I want to be clear about this, because he'd been on my mind. It was because I'd had a genuinely terrible week. My espresso machine had made a sound on Wednesday morning that my technician described as not a good sound. And fixing it cost me $1,400 that I did not have sitting around doing nothing. My landlord had sent an email about the possibility of a rent review, which is one of those phrases that means something bad is coming but hasn't arrived yet. And my ex had, through the apparently very small world of mutual acquaintances, sent me a message on Instagram that said, "Saw you at Perch the other week. You looked great. Hope you're doing well." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I closed the app and called Rafferty. He picked up on the second ring. "I thought it would be longer," he said. "I've had a week," I said. "Tell me," he said. So I did. Standing in my empty bakery at 9 o'clock at night, with the chairs up on the tables and the display case cleaned out, and the smell of the day's bread still warm in the walls, I told a man I'd met once for dinner about my espresso machine, and my landlord, and my Instagram notification. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 or 3 very precise questions. He said, "Your landlord is testing you. Don't respond tonight. Respond Monday morning professionally and ask for a meeting in writing. It changes the dynamic. How do you know about landlord dynamics? I asked. I buy buildings, he said. Oh, right, acquisitions. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone after and was mildly alarmed by myself. The second date was coffee, on a Sunday, at a place near the bakery. He showed up 3 minutes early, which I respected. He looked at the display case with genuine interest and asked which of the pastries I'd made that morning, and I pointed and he said, "The cardamom ones." "Everyone orders the almond croissant," I said. "I'm not everyone," he said, not in a braggy way, just factually. He was right about the cardamom ones. The third date was a walk along the seawall and dinner at a quiet place in Kitsilano, where the owner came out to say hello. To Rafferty and I filed that away as interesting. The fourth date was cooking dinner at his apartment in the West End, where I learned that he had very specific knife skills, owned 3 types of olive oil for different purposes, and had a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that contained exactly 2 books I'd also read and 17 I'd been meaning to. "You're very deliberate," I told him, that night, sitting on his couch while he made coffee from what appeared to be a very serious machine. "Is that a complaint?" he asked. "Just an observation. I like knowing what I'm doing," he said, "before I do it." He brought the coffee over and sat down, close but not presuming. "What are you doing?" I asked. He looked at me directly. "Trying to convince you that I'm worth the uncertainty." I looked back at him. "You're doing okay," I said. He leaned over and kissed me, very quietly, and the coffee went cold. I'm not going to pretend the next 6 months were simple. They weren't. There was a lot about Rafferty that I had to learn slowly, in layers. He was not, it turned out, purely in real estate. The acquisitions were real. He owned properties, managed investments, had a small team that he spoke to with quiet authority. But there were aspects of his work that he explained in broad terms and didn't elaborate on, and there were phone calls he stepped out to take, and there were 1 or 2 moments where someone in a public place gave him a particular kind of look. Not quite deference, something more watchful than that, and he never explained it. I asked him, eventually. A Sunday morning in my kitchen, flour on both our hands because he'd been helping me test a new pastry recipe. He was actually useful, which was a small miracle. "Rafferty," I said, "what is it you actually do?" He was quiet for a moment. "More than real estate," he said. "Things I handled before I had enough distance from them to choose something else." "Illegal things?" I asked. I kept my voice steady. He looked at me. "Past tense things," he said. "Things I'm no longer part of. But things that left, relationships, obligations, history that doesn't vanish just because you've moved on." I put down the rolling pin. "Is that going to be a problem for us?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't want it to be," he said. "I'm working to make sure it isn't." It wasn't a full answer, I knew that, but it was an honest one. And I'd spent 4 years running a business that had taught me the difference between someone who was evading and someone who was genuinely trying to give you what they could. I stayed, not naively. I'm not going to romanticize it. I asked questions when I needed to. I set limits I believed in. When, in March, something happened. A meeting that had to be canceled abruptly. A man I'd never seen before who showed up at the bakery and asked for me by name in a way that made my stomach drop. I called Rafferty immediately, and I did not soften my voice. "I need to know," I said. "All of it, or I'm done." So he told me. Not on the phone. He came to the bakery after close, and we sat across from each other at one of the small tables with 2 cups of tea neither of us drank, and he told me. He'd grown up in a world he hadn't chosen. Family money that came from places he'd understood too late. Connections that his brothers had embedded themselves in long before he was old enough to know better. He'd extracted himself, slowly, at cost, over years. There were people who still considered him a resource, who called in proximity when they needed pressure applied, who treated his attempt at legitimacy as a hobby he'd eventually grow out of. The man who came in, he said, he was a message. A message saying, "What?" I asked. "Saying that some people aren't ready to let me be finished," he said. "I'm handling it." "What does handling it mean?" "It means using the leverage I have," he said. "Legally, carefully. I have a solicitor in Victoria who is very good at this and who I pay an embarrassing amount of money to be available." I looked at him. Are you in danger? I asked. No, he said. Then honestly, not significantly. Am I? A long pause. Something moved across his face. I would not let that happen, he said. I would. He stopped. Started again. I left that world because I found things worth protecting. You are the thing I'm most protecting. I need you to know that, even if you decide this is too much. The tea had gone cold. I run a bakery on Commercial Drive, I said. I wake up at 4 in the morning and I manage my hydro bills and I worry about Gary's Yelp review. This is not the life I imagined for myself. He said nothing. But you are not what I imagined either, I said, and I think I'm better for knowing you. So I'm going to need you to be honest with me. Completely, all the time. And I'm going to need it to be over, whatever isn't over. It will be, he said. Soon? Before the end of the year, he said. And there was something in his voice, certain, grounded, that I believed. I reached across the table and picked up my cold tea. Okay, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. And then he did something I hadn't seen him do before. He reached up and pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, briefly, like a man setting something down that he'd been carrying a long time. We didn't talk about it again that night. We stayed in the bakery until late, and I taught him how to shape sourdough properly. He'd been doing it almost right, the whole time. And he was a quick learner, as it turned out, as with most things. By November, it was over. I won't pretend I understood all the details. I understood that solicitors had done things, and documents had been signed, and people had been satisfied with arrangements that did not require Rafferty's ongoing involvement. I understood that the phone calls changed, became less frequent, less terse, less loaded with silence around the edges. I understood that the Sunday mornings in the West End became quieter in a different way, like something had exhaled. It's done, he told me, on a rainy Thursday evening in my kitchen, setting his phone face down on the counter in a way that felt final. All of it? I asked. All of it, he said. I'd learned by then not to ask for elaboration when his tone was that specific kind of settled. There are things that are better left in the past they come from. I kissed him instead. He was very careful about proposing. This surprised me, but it probably shouldn't have. Everything with Rafferty was deliberate. He spent 3 months figuring out the right moment, and he still managed to do it on an ordinary Tuesday morning, in February, when I was taking the first trays out of the oven and the bakery wasn't even open yet, and I had flour on my apron, and very likely on my face. He just came in with coffee, he had a key, and stood there in the half-light of the early morning while I pretended not to notice that he was nervous, which was genuinely new on him, and he said, I want to marry you. I know the timing is not. Yes, I said. He stopped, he said. Yes, I said. The croissants need another 4 minutes, and yes. He laughed. A full laugh, not the half-smile version, and it was the best sound I'd ever heard in that kitchen. My aunt cried, of course. She always cries at good news. She'd met Rafferty 3 times and declared him steady, which is the highest compliment she gives anyone. She also noted immediately that he had very good posture. I do not know why that mattered to her, but it clearly did. We got married the following October. Small wedding on Vancouver Island. About 40 people. A heritage barn my best friend had found online and refused to relinquish. Fall light coming in through old windows. I wore something ivory and not very formal, and my aunt walked me in because we don't really have a family structure that involves fathers in ceremonial roles, and it was exactly right. Rafferty cried a little. He would probably dispute this. He would be wrong. My ex sent a congratulations email. I didn't respond, and I didn't feel bad about not responding, and I thought, there it is. That's the thing that's finally finished. My daughter was born 2.5 years later. Spring. We named her after no one in particular. Rafferty had been very firm about not using family names, which I respected, given the specific complications his family names came with. We picked something we both just liked, something that sounded like itself and nothing else. She has his eyes and my stubbornness, and a temperament that is going to be either exhausting or extraordinary when she's older, and possibly both. Rafferty brings her to the bakery on Saturday mornings, now. She sits up on the counter, in the spot that's technically not a food preparation area, so it's fine. and she watches me the way small children watch things that are bright and warm. She has, on 2 occasions, put her hands directly into unbaked dough and made a sound of total satisfaction. She's going to be a baker, I think. Or she's going to be something I haven't thought of yet. Either way, she'll be stubborn enough to make it work. There's a photo on the wall of the morning ledge, not behind the counter, just near the window, somewhere only regulars notice. It's nothing fancy. Just me and Rafferty and the baby, taken last Christmas, in the kitchen of the bakery after hours. We all have flour on us, including her, which wasn't entirely accidental. My aunt took the photo. She cried right after. The bakery still isn't making me rich. But it's still mine, and now there are other things that are mine too. Things I couldn't have planned for on that Tuesday night when I was elbow deep in sourdough, and someone sat down across from me and said I know, like the whole evening had already been decided. Maybe it had. I'm still not sure I believe in things being decided. But I believe in flour and hydration ratios, and the way early morning light comes through the front window of the shop at around 6:15. And I believe in a man who learned to shape sourdough almost correctly and kept at it until he got it right. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's everything.